Okay, part three of this week's lecture on attitudes and persuasion. So we're up to the section on attitude change, which is going to be the section on persuasion. So just a quick recap, we're going to be talking about the approach, the source, the message, the evidence, and the audience, and how at any one of these 5 points, that's where we can start to look at ways of informing attitude change. Okay, so just a really quick recap. We know that attitude definitions have changed. So originally it was just a case of, do you have a positive, how do you feel about this thing? It's a positive or a negative attitude. But now we know that we're talking about reactions to an attitude object, which can be positive or negative or mixed. And we also know that it's now towards a person or an object or an idea. So we're talking about being able to evaluate pretty much anything and have an attitude towards that. We also know that the attitudes and behavior relationship is pretty limited. So we talked before about it accounting for somewhere between 4 and 9% of the variance in behaviors. So we also mentioned the idea that although we know that this relationship does sometimes exist, what we're more interested in is under what conditions does it start to appear. So we know that some attitudes are related to behavior and others aren't. We also know that it's only in ideal situations when that relationship does start to appear. So we talked about the theory of planned behavior. So it's got to do with the attitude, it's got to do with the subjective norms, so what the important people in your life also think, and about perceived behavioral control. But we also talked about accessibility and utility and salience, and how all of these things relate to the attitude-behavior relationship. Okay, so before we get into change, a quick reminder about how attitudes are formed, because this is going to influence how easily they can be changed. So attitudes are formed automatically. We are born with this predisposition to form attitudes towards attitude objects. However, there are genetic differences in how this happens, and this manifests as a tendency for how easily we form strong or weak impressions. Right? Or strong or weak impressions, which become strong or weak attitudes. Cool. So attitudes can be changed pretty much by, they don't just change organically, they change when we're presented with new information. And that new information can be counter to what we previously thought, which would maybe change the attitude, or it can reaffirm what we already thought, which can strengthen the attitude or bolster the attitude. So I have here a diagram. I'm sorry about the lighting here. So we can see here that in this particular seesaw, we see a sun representing some good information, and then we see this here representing some bad information, and the seesaw is tipping towards a positive attitude. Right, so there's more negative than positive. However, if we then get a little bit more information about this, and it's a large amount of negative information, if we put that negative information on the same side as the seesaw, it tips. And so now that there's more negative information than positive information, the attitude has changed, and the seesaw now tips towards the negative. Right, so that's pretty much how it happens. But of course, there's a lot about the new information that we get that influences whether or not it causes our attitudes to tip in the other direction. Right, so probably the most important thing that we need to know about persuasion or attitude change is this dual process model to persuasion, which was originally proposed by Petty and Cacciapol in 86. And this model was reasonably early on in ideas of persuasion and attitude change, and it's a long-lasting one. It's a great one. So again, my apologies about the text here. 1 second. Does it help? Ah, there we go. Okay, so we have the source message, right? So we're talking here about this dual process model is talking about content of the source, so the person delivering the message. So the person delivers the message, and then the audience can be broken into two types of people: those who have high ability and high levels of motivation, and these people use the central route to persuasion. Right, so we're going to be talking about the central route, and in the other direction, there's people with low ability and motivation, and they tend to use the peripheral route to persuasion. Right, so we can think about how different types of people respond differently to different types of information. So here we have a quick brief rundown of what the two differences are. The central route pays more attention to the reception and the acceptance and the elaboration of new information. And impediments to the use of the central root are self-esteem and IQ. This will make more sense in a second when I give you some more information in terms of an example. People using the peripheral route tend to pay attention to the features of the message rather than the content. So when using the peripheral route, we're more likely to be paying attention to how colourful is, if it's an ad, for example, trying to convince you to buy something. How colourful is that? How fun is it? How funny is it? How much colour? What's the background music? The features of the speaker. Is it an attractive person delivering the message? Those sorts of things. And we can also talk about the feature of your response. So the peripheral route also can sort of capture how it makes you feel. So we can think of the central route as being much more about the content of the message, the statistics and the figures being delivered when we're trying to persuade someone, whereas the peripheral route is more about the production value, we could call it. So if we think about political messages, we know that some people will be won over in a political message that uses statistics and figures about an argument, and others will rely on the politician kissing a baby or having a cute puppy dog like I talked about in the previous section. So the example I'm going to give you here is there are two ways that we could try and convince someone to form an attitude or change an attitude, or at least get new information about an attitude object. And going to use, you can't see this, it's an aftershave, Emporio Armani aftershave. So one way could be to have a scientist present some information about how it wasn't tested on animals and how it's good for your skin and how it reacts to the transconductance in your in the skin, and it reacts with that to produce a certain smell, and it was related to your pheromones. Insert science here. The other would be to just say, this handsome, attractive, and successful with the ladies, gentleman wears this, and so should you. And so on the left is the central route to persuasion, and on the right is the peripheral route to persuasion. Right? And so the argument is that people who are high in motivation, high in IQ, high in self-esteem, are more likely to be using the central route, so they're going to be relying on the scientist, and people who are lower in IQ, lower in self-esteem, lower in motivation, or are cognitively drained, we'll go through a list of all of these in a moment, are more likely to be influenced by the peripheral route. Okay, so a little bit more about the source is the credibility of the source, right? So if you have a highly credible source, people are more likely to be paying attention to it. And by the source, I mean the person delivering the new information. So speakers can have personal motives which can affect credibility. So a quite famous case is this idea that John Laws and Alan Jones were both previously quite vocally against Telstra. And then John Laws was given $300,000 a year or something like this to be a public advocate for Telstra. And so, Telstra, I guess their PR team would assume that having someone that was previously against them suddenly being on side with them would convince people to be pro-Telstra. But of course, this act of suddenly backflipping on your ideas really lends itself to the idea that this is a low in credibility source. Low in credibility, right? And so similar things can happen when politicians backflip on their platforms, or, when we get new information about whether a big one actually is when about dieting. 1 week it feels like we should be eating all the carbs and no sugars, and then the next week it's sugars are evil and we should just eat all carbs and no sugar. Right, so whenever these sorts of ideas change constantly, it lowers the credibility of the source. Cool, so the idea here is that credible speakers have both competence, or we can think of it as being expertise relevant to that situation, and they're trustworthy. So if we think about this in terms of the stereotype content model, PYSC's stereotype content model, we're talking about being high on both the competence dimension and the warmth dimension. I have here this example of Ian Thorpe, who suddenly and randomly started being a spokesperson and salesman for high quality pearls. pearl necklaces. So, you know, the idea is that he is perceived as being quite trustworthy. You know, for a long time he was Australia's angel of the Olympic pool, but not sure that we could be convinced that he has relative expertise in pearls. You know, apart from the fact that they grow in oysters, which are also sea creatures, and arguably Thorpe is a sea creature, but beyond that, he has no expertise in pearl growing or pearl selling, so he perhaps was not the best choice as a spokesperson. However, he doesn't have credibility, but he does have likability. So there's a few things to do with likability. There is the actual liking the person, thinking they're a nice person. There's liking them because they're similar to you. So, you know, I like them because they're like me. Or the idea of I'd like to be like you. Right, so both of these things fall into the likability category. Then we also have the what versus the who. So some situations have messages that are highly relevant to you, personal relevance. So I've got a note here, when the message is highly relevant to you, you are likely to pay attention to both the source and to think critically about the message. Right, so we're going to be thinking about both the source and the content of the message. But in contrast, when it's not relevant to you, the credibility of the source carries a lot more weight. So if someone's trying to sell you something that you don't care anything about, but you need to do it, let's say you're forced to have car insurance. That's a bad example. Yeah, if you have you and your partner need to get car insurance for your car, but you don't have a license, so you don't drive the car, so it's not really relevant to you personally. In this case, you're going to be paying a lot more attention to the credibility of the source, the person selling you the insurance. Whereas if you were the person driving the car, you would be more interested in both the source, you know, the features of the person selling it to you, but also about the message. So, you know, what's involved in it, what exactly does it cover you for, these sorts of things. Cool, and then there's the sleeper effect. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the sleeper effect in a second, but it's basically the idea that the messages that come through the peripheral route to persuasion, they're not always super convincing at first, depending on, you know, how it's received and what it's about, but it tends to just sort of grow on you over time. Right, this is the sleeper effect. We'll talk a bit more in a second. Okay, so a little bit of evidence for the dual route to persuasion. Petty and colleagues had some students evaluate whether they should have to pass what we called like a comprehensive exams to graduate. So you could imagine that in the case of your degree, let's say you're doing a Bachelor of Psychology, that, you know, you do your, how many units do you do? 24 units of your undergraduate degree, and then technically you've completed the requirements. But if we then said, okay, now you have to also do a Bachelor of Psychology final comprehensive exam before you can graduate, which kind of would evaluate all of the knowledge from all 24 units in one hit. That's the idea of what this is talking about. So these guys had 3 independent variables. They experimentally manipulated each of them. So they either said that the source came from an authoritative figure or a non-authoritative figure. So in this case, the source either came from a university professor that said it was going to be necessary to do this to make, you know, the quality of the degree more worthwhile, or it came from a non-authoritative source, so just a fellow colleague that was also a high school student. They also manipulated the strength of the arguments. They had a strong or a weak argument. So in the strong argument condition, they were presented with data, you know, it was trialled in a different university and it worked out really well. And in the weak argument condition, it was anecdotal, so, you know, hearsay. And then the third independent variable was the relevance. So it was either it was going to happen in the next year, which was going to be the year where they were graduating, or in 10 years' time, so it wasn't going to impact them at all. So in this 2x2x2 fully experimental between subjects design, so everyone was in one condition, so they were either saw a uni professor or a high school student deliver the message with data that was an argument that was either data driven or anecdotal, and they were told it was either happening that year or in 10 years' time. The results really clearly showed some strong evidence for the dual route to persuasion by showing that students who weren't affected sided with the credible speaker. Right, so when it wasn't going to affect them, they went through the peripheral route, whereas students who would be affected were convinced by the stronger arguments, the central route to persuasion. Right? So when it was going to be affecting them, definitely, they wanted to see facts. They wanted data, and they wanted it to come from the professor. Okay, so that's about the source. Now a bit more about the message. So in terms of the features of the message, if you think about some of these late night ads that trying to sell you, knives or shoes or cars or whatever the case is, you would think based on that, half-hour long telecommercial that the more facts you tell, the more you would sell. And this is perhaps true, but length of the message only increases the persuasiveness when it's good, right? So the more good evidence is in a long message, the more persuasive it is, but length alone isn't sufficient. So you can't just be spinning out the same facts over and over again, or you can't be using, mediocre or poor evidence. You need to have good evidence, right? So I've got this note here: long arguments that include repetition, ambiguous evidence, or a lack of evidence, if it's just anecdotal, actually dilute the persuasiveness. So the length of a message can actually make you it worse off. We might need to think about order effects. So, if you were going to be one of three people presenting your arguments, do you want to go first or last? There's a lot of mixed message here. There's no the bottom line of this is that there's no clear effective order, but it seems that the recency effect works best if one argument is far more recent than the other. So, if it was one person a day for 3 days in a row, you would want to go on the last day so that your message is the most recent. But it seems that if there's a long delay between when all the arguments are presented and the decisions being made, the primacy effect actually works best. But again, there's no real clear effect here. But both primacy and recency effects are better than being in the middle. So you basically want to go first or last in order to make your message persuasive. Okay, so that's features of the message. A little bit about the content of the message itself. You're best off using moderate content rather than extreme content, right, in order to create a discrepancy that might motivate attitude change. If we think about the type of content, you might want to be using fear as a motivator, right? People often use fear as a motivator for attitude change, particularly on social issues. But there's a difference between creating fear that alerts people to the situation and fear that alarms people or that people find quite scary, right? And we also have to be careful when using positive emotions, because the flip side to that is people think, oh, let's paint a nice message about this, make it all seem all fun and happy and unicorns and rainbows. But the problem with that is that when we make people happy, they become quite complacent, right? And so people aren't going to change their attitudes in a situation where they're already happy unless it's going to make them even more happy. Right? So the idea of maybe making change that might make them less happy isn't going to work. Right, I've got here a note that positive emotions are distracting because they're more fun than having to evaluate arguments seriously. And that there is potential effort required in attitude change that would kill the buzz around positive emotions. Cool. And then the final note that I have here about the content is that subliminal messages, so messages below the level of consciousness, can activate the idea of the attitude, but alone they can't persuade. Right, so you'd need to activate the attitude subliminally and then pair it with, a fun emotion or something like this. Okay, a bit about the audience. So we already know that, you as the audience, based on that peripheral route versus the central route persuasion, that the person might be high or low in IQ or high or low in motivation or high or low in self-esteem. There are some other individual differences that are worth noting. So one is this idea of the need for cognition. This is fairly closely related to IQ. Some people just are high in this need for cognition. They need to keep their minds busy. Right, so people who are high in need for cognition will enjoy doing Sudokus. During their vacation, they'll prefer to go to museums or see things or do courses and learn things rather than go and hang out on the beach. Right? It isn't the same as IQ, as being smart or not. It's just the idea of keeping your mind busy. Whereas people who are low in need for cognition are probably more likely to want to get home from work and just veg out and watch mindless TV or yeah, might be more content doing things like having beach holidays, relaxing holidays, right? And so I hope that that didn't come across as demeaning. Low need for cognition is not related to stupidness or anything. It's just an individual difference in how much we like to use our brain all the time. Cool. I've got there another example of how we measure it. So these are three items from a scale that measures the need for cognition. I really enjoy tasks that involve coming up with new solutions to problems. High need for cognition. Thinking is not my idea of fun. Low need for cognition. Cool. And so I have here that high need for cognition people tend to engage with the content more and thus to use the central processing route. Right, so high need for cognition people tend to be convinced by strong, rational arguments that are content dominated, right, rather than glamorous colours and pretty packaging. I sound really demeaning again. I don't mean to do that. My apologies. The flip side of that is that people who are lower in need for cognition are less likely to be persuaded by content-dominated arguments, and they're happier to change their attitudes based on peripheral cues. Okay, self-monitoring is another individual difference in that some people walk around the world and they more closely pay attention to themselves, what they're wearing, how they're speaking, how quickly they're speaking, how loudly they're speaking. They're more likely to look at themselves in the reflection as they walk past and check that their hair's not out of place. Those sorts of things, right? So that would be high in self-monitoring. So there's a whole bunch of research that shows that people who are high in self-monitoring are more likely to use the peripheral route than people who are low in self-monitoring. So low self-monitorers are more likely to use the central route. Now, the reason I have these two pictures of perfume bottles in here is that it's a really nice analogy to how people who are high or low self-monitorers are persuaded to buy different types of perfume or aftershave. So the argument here is that people who are high in self-monitoring are more likely to pick the bottle on the left, which is fancier looking bottle. Whereas the person on the right, a low self-monitor is more likely to pick the bottle that is less fancy because it's what's on the inside of the bottle that counts. And so the analogy is that a low self-monitor thinks that about themselves. They're less appearance focused. So they're more likely to think that it's what's on the inside of them that counts, and then they're more likely to think about what's on the inside of the perfume bottle rather than the content itself. Don't know if that helps or not, but there you go. We can have a little bit of a think about an audience who are who have effective resistance, right? So we can talk about things like attitude bolstering and counter-arguing. So one of the hardest ways to persuade people is or the hardest kind of person to persuade is someone who is aware of the fact that they're about to be persuaded, right? So if I say to you, hey, I'm going to try and convince you to vote for me for class president, right? As soon as you know that you're about to be persuaded, you kind of get this defensive psychological reactance on, right? You know that it's about to happen, and so you can bolster your own attitude. It strengthens the attitudes that you already have, and you're more likely to engage in counter-arguing. Right, we also get this idea of the devil's advocate. Some people will just argue any and every point for the sake of keeping all arguments active. Right, so this comes into effective resistance, and of course, there's ideas around social validation. Some people are more likely to need social validation before they can be persuaded. There's also notions here around the negative effect and the assertions of confidence that come with being persuaded. And I don't think we need to talk about these, although we do know that source derogation is related to the audience. So if the one person trying to convince you is just bad-mouthing their opponent, that makes them less appealing. Okay, now we're going to talk about persuasion by action, right? So the behaviors that might be involved in attitude change. So there's lots of evidence about our own actions as evidence. So I have here a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, not because the movie is anything to do with persuasion itself, but I wanted to flag the idea that when we're acting in a certain way, it can convince us to persuade our attitudes about something. So this is quite famous, this movie, because it's the movie in which Brad and Angelina became Brangelina, right? So from a psychological perspective, we could argue that Brad Pitt was acting in love with Angelina Jolie in this movie, and that by feeling his own actions, pretending that he was in love with her, he actually did convince himself that this was true, and then he changed his attitudes towards Angelina as the attitude object, right, forgetting about his lovely wife. And I'm just going to throw it out that I'm on Team Aniston, but that's irrelevant to this particular part of the lecture. Right, so this kind of comes into ideas around role-playing, some evidence that we have around role-playing as persuasion by own action is that we know that if you give a counter-attitudinal speech, so you give a speech about something that you don't believe in, you're more likely to be affected by your own speech than if you listen to the same counter-attitudinal speech. Right, so if you're against climate change and then you're forced to give, in a debate, for example, or a class presentation, you're forced to give a speech on pro-climate change, then your attitude is more likely to be changed or persuaded than if you listen to the same speech. Right, so there's role-playing. We also know that there's evidence from the facial feedback hypothesis. So I have here a picture of a researcher who's quite famous, and she was involved in this facial feedback stuff. If you ask people to hold a pencil between their teeth, it forces you to use the same muscles in your face that you use when you smile. And so the facial feedback hypothesis would suggest that if you force your face into the shape of a smile, it tricks your brain into thinking that you are smiling and thus that you're happy. Right, so this is some evidence for a facial feedback hypothesis, and that can convince you to be persuaded about things. Right, so if you're holding a pencil in between your mouth and then you're looking at something that you didn't previously like, you're more likely to then like it. Right, similar sort of idea behind gestures as evidence. We talked a little bit before about cognitive dissonance, but I wanted to talk about one really famous experiment here. So there was an experiment in which the participants came into the lab at the university and were asked to do a really, really boring, monotonous task. So it was something along the lines of sorting mail into people whose surnames started with a vowel versus a consonant, something as simple as this. For a long time, it was really boring, very uninvigorating, and then at the end of it, they were either given $1 for their time or $20 for their time. Right, but then the tricky part of this experiment is that they then asked those people to have to persuade the next person to become a participant. Right, and what they found was that people who were paid $20, they left the experiment and they were very honest. They said to the next people, look, this is really boring. Their attitude towards the task. It's a boring task, but we just need someone to do it. People, on the other hand, who were given $1 had this cognitive dissonance that they'd just spent all of this time doing a really, really boring task and they'd been underpaid for it and they had to try and convince someone else to do it. So in order to resolve that dissonance around having to convince someone else to do a task that they didn't like themselves, so the negative attitude, they actually went out and told people that it wasn't that bad. The task wasn't that bad. Sure, it was boring and uninvigorating, but once you get into the rhythm of it, it's fine. So there's some evidence there that cognitive dissonance can lead to attitude change. Right? So there's a whole section in the textbook on this. Another example is around cognitive dissonance and attitude is, let's say that you have a lab report due tomorrow or later in the week, and a really close friend of yours rocks up, they've just been dumped or their cat just died or something like this, and they rock up with a bottle of wine and they want to drink with you. Right, so you have this cognitive dissonance. You know that for uni, you really should spend the night working on your lab report. But as a good friend, you know that you should be comforting the friend and helping them to drink that Sangiovese. Right, so what do you do in order to resolve that dissonance? You have to pick one, and then we can start to look at the different types of things in terms of how the decisions that you make around this can lead to different preferences down the track. So if you, in the past, you know that you've been able to pull an all-nighter, or if you know that you can have 2 glasses of wine and then still write a lab report, or if you know that you can have 1 glass of wine and then stop, all of these things that you know from your previous actions can lead to your current, let's call it persuasions by action. Okay, I have here a little model that I'm going to show you really quickly. So attitude discrepant behaviors can lead to unwanted negative consequences. Right, we know this, but if they also lead to personal responsibility and physiological arousal and the attribution of the arousal to the attitude discrepant behavior, this can then lead to attitude change. Right, so at some point, it's probably really worth your while coming up with an example for yourself and going through that attitude discrepant behavior to attitude change model and seeing how it all fits in there. Cool. Just a couple of other things I want to throw really quickly before I finish this lecture is, I'm not even going to talk about self-perception theory, but it definitely is worth talking about impression management theory, right? Which is the theory of social desirability, right? So impression management theory is a theory of social desirability, wanting to present yourself in a way that makes you appear socially desirable, or maybe unracist or modern and hip. And what that means is that there sometimes will be the appearance of attitude change in the absence of actual attitude change, right? So if you grew up in a house of Labour voters, but you personally vote Liberal, when you're with your family, you might use impression management techniques to suppress talking about your Liberal voting tendencies, and instead you might even lie about it and say that you don't vote Liberal, or you might even lie further and say that you do vote Labour. Okay, that wrapped up very quickly. So that's attitudes and attitude change in a nutshell. Next week we'll be talking about conformity, which is closely related to still, I guess you could say attitude change, not so much persuasion as attitude formation and attitude change, and it definitely links to the attitude behavior relationship. Cool, thanks guys, see you soon.